Okay, so you want to own a casino. Free drinks, a floor full of flashing lights, thousands of people voluntarily handing you their money every single night, and a mathematical edge built right into every single game on the floor. It sounds like the closest thing to a guaranteed business that exists. And in a narrow sense, that's true. The math genuinely is rigged in your favor on every single spin, every single hand, every single night. Here's what that guaranteed edge doesn't guarantee. One casino on the Atlantic City boardwalk cost $2.4 billion to build, closed after just 2 years of operation, and sold at auction for $110 million, about 4.5% of what it cost to construct. The math was still in the house's favor every single night it was open. The business still collapsed anyway. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why a guaranteed statistical edge doesn't automatically guarantee a business. People think a casino is a gambling business where the point is offering games people want to play. In reality, the games themselves are closer to a manufacturing process with a fixed, known defect rate built in on purpose. Every game on the floor is mathematically designed to return slightly less to players than they wager, on average, over enough spins and enough hands. That built-in edge isn't the business, it's the raw material. The actual business is everything wrapped around that edge. The free drinks, the hotel rooms, the loyalty program, the entertainment, all of it engineered to keep enough people playing enough hands for enough hours for that tiny mathematical edge to compound into real money. Miss that distinction and you can build a spectacular packed casino floor that still loses money every single year. A tribal casino operates on sovereign Native American land under a different legal and tax framework than any other category in this business, often with lower effective tax rates but real obligations to the tribal nation and community it belongs to. A commercial casino is licensed directly by a state government, competing openly for a license, paying that state's specific tax rate on every dollar it wins, and subject to whatever gaming commission oversees that jurisdiction. A riverboat or racetrack casino, sometimes called a racino, grew out of decades-old laws that only permitted gambling on water or attached to horse racing, historical restrictions that still shape where some of these properties sit today, even in states that eventually loosened the original rules. And an online or iGaming operator skips the physical floor entirely, competing instead on app design, payment speed, and game selection, a category still working out which of the old rules about physical casinos even apply to it. This video mostly follows the commercial casino path, because it's the one most people picture when they imagine owning one, and it's where the gap between the guaranteed math and the real financial risk is easiest to see clearly. Underneath all four categories sits the same basic trade every operator eventually confronts. How much of the property's success depends on a location decision made once at the very start versus how much depends on ongoing management skill applied every single day afterward. A tribal casino often inherits an exclusive, geographically protected market by law, insulating it from some of the competitive pressure a commercial license holder has to worry about constantly. A commercial casino in an open, competitive state has no such protection and has to outmanage every rival within driving distance indefinitely just to hold its market share steady. Start with the license itself, because in this business, the license can cost more than the building. In New York's most recent downstate casino licensing round, the state set a minimum license fee of $500 million, on top of a required minimum capital investment of another $500 million. $1 billion in commitments before a single card gets dealt. That's the extreme end, but it illustrates the principle. In this business, the government is often the single largest line item, not the construction crew. Construction costs vary just as dramatically by ambition. A modest riverboat or racino-style property can open for tens of millions of dollars. A full-scale destination resort casino, the kind with a hotel tower, multiple restaurants, and a genuine entertainment complex attached, routinely runs into the billions. The Revel Casino Hotel on the Atlantic City boardwalk cost $2.4 billion to build. The Trump Taj Mahal, a full ocean liner scale resort when it opened, cost close to $1 billion in its own era. Neither of those numbers includes the license fees, the years of carrying costs before opening day, or the working capital needed to cover payroll and comps before the doors even open to the public. The licensing process itself can take years, and it isn't a simple application form. A serious commercial license bid typically requires demonstrating a detailed workforce plan, community and local government support, environmental and infrastructure commitments, and a credible financing plan for the entire project, all before a regulator will even seriously evaluate the proposal. Losing bidders in a competitive licensing round often spend tens of millions of dollars on legal, engineering, and community outreach costs with nothing to show for it if a rival's bid wins the license instead. A sunk cost risk that exists before construction has even been considered. Here's the variable that matters more than almost anything else in this industry, and it's set entirely by geography. States tax casino winnings, the money the house actually keeps, at wildly different rates. Colorado taxes gaming revenue as low as 0.25% at the bottom of its bracket. Nevada, the industry's original home, keeps its rate famously low to attract operators in the first place. Maryland taxes at up to 62.5%. Pennsylvania taxes slot machine revenue specifically at 54%, while taxing table games in the same building at just 16%. An enormous gap that shapes exactly which games an operator in that state has the strongest incentive to push. That patchwork means the exact same casino, with the exact same games, the exact same house edge, and the exact same customers, can be a genuinely profitable business in one state and a marginal one in the state next door, purely based on what percentage of winnings the government keeps before the operator sees $1 of it. Choosing where to build isn't just a real estate decision in this business. It's a decision about which government you're effectively going into partnership with and how generous a partner they intend to be. Nevada's low tax rate isn't an accident of history so much as a deliberate long-term strategy. When the state legalized gambling in 1931, in the depths of the Great Depression, keeping the tax burden light was a calculated bet that a thriving, growing industry taxed lightly would generate more total revenue over time than a smaller industry taxed heavily. 9 decades later, that bet looks largely vindicated. Nevada built an entire tourism economy around casino gaming precisely because operators could build there with a credible expectation that the state wouldn't tax away their margin the way other jurisdictions eventually did. States that came to legal gambling later, often needing to close a specific budget gap quickly, frequently took the opposite bet, setting tax rates high enough to extract maximum short-term revenue, sometimes at the cost of the kind of long-term reinvestment that keeps a property competitive decades later. A casino floor of any real size runs 24 hours a day, every single day of the year, which means payroll never actually stops. Dealers, security, surveillance staff monitoring every table and machine, cashiers, hospitality staff, and management all need coverage around the clock across every shift, including the slow overnight hours when a table might sit with a single player and a full staff still has to be present to run it legally. Comps, the free rooms, meals, and drinks handed out to keep valuable customers playing, are a real and substantial expense, not a marketing footnote. A casino's loyalty program exists specifically to identify which customers are worth subsidizing and by how much, tracking individual play patterns closely enough to calculate a specific customer's expected lifetime value down to the dollar, then spending accordingly to keep that exact customer in their seat rather than at a competitor's table down the street. Security and surveillance costs run higher here than in almost any other retail environment. For the obvious reason, a casino floor handles more physical cash in a single night than most businesses see in a year, and the entire property is built around a legal requirement to prove to regulators that every single game is being run exactly as licensed. Add marketing, entertainment bookings meant to pull foot traffic in the door, and the underlying cost of maintaining a hotel tower if one is attached, and the operating cost structure of a full-scale casino resort looks less like a card room and more like running a hospital and a luxury hotel at the same time, one that happens to also have a card room in it. There's a compliance cost layer specific to this industry that most first-time operators underestimate. Every casino of meaningful size is required to run anti-money laundering monitoring, report large cash transactions to federal regulators, and fund a responsible gambling program that includes self-exclusion lists and staff trained to recognize problem gambling behavior. None of that spending increases revenue. All of it is mandatory, and failing to fund it adequately doesn't just risk a fine, it risks the license itself, the single asset that makes every other number in this video possible in the first place. This is the number that explains almost everything else about how a casino floor is actually designed, and it starts with a split most visitors never think about. Slot machines generate roughly 65 to 70% of total US casino revenue, even though they occupy a similar or larger share of the actual floor space and attract 70 to 80% of visiting gamblers. gamblers. Table games, the blackjack, craps, and poker tables people picture when they imagine a casino, generate a much smaller share of total revenue despite getting most of the cultural attention. The house edge itself varies enormously by game, and this is where the actual profit engineering happens. Slot machines typically hold somewhere between 2 and 15% of every dollar wagered, averaging around 7 to 10% depending on the jurisdiction and the specific machine. Three-card poker, a popular table game, can hold north of 30%. Craps, by contrast, offers some of the best odds on the entire floor for a skilled player, with a house edge that can drop below 2% on specific bets. A casino doesn't need every game to be equally profitable. It needs the overall mix, weighted by how much floor space and marketing attention each game gets, to add up to a reliable, repeatable number every single month. Walk the arithmetic through on a single, unglamorous statistic. The average slot player loses somewhere between $200 and $300 per visit. Multiply that by thousands of visits a week at a mid-sized property, and the business starts to look less like gambling and more like a subscription service with extremely high churn, where each individual customer's single session is small, but the aggregate across enough sessions compounds into a real and highly predictable number. That predictability is precisely the asset a casino is actually selling to investors and lenders. Not the excitement of any single bet, but the statistical certainty of what 10,000 bets look like added together. Total commercial casino gaming revenue in the US reached roughly $49 billion in a recent year, generating close to $14 billion in direct state and local tax revenue. That tax number is worth sitting with for a moment because it's the other side of the regulatory coin from the entry costs earlier in this video. States extract a meaningful share of casino revenue precisely because the underlying math is so reliable that even a steep tax rate still leaves operators with a viable business, in the states where the rate is calibrated sensibly. In the states where it isn't, that same math can turn marginal fast. Progressive jackpots deserve a specific mention because they're one of the few places on the floor where the house edge gets temporarily complicated. A portion of every wager on a linked progressive machine feeds a shared jackpot pool that grows until someone wins it, and the machine's advertised long-run house edge already accounts for that eventual payout being spread across millions of prior spins. The massive jackpot a player occasionally wins isn't the casino losing its edge. It's the edge working exactly as designed, just concentrated into one dramatic, highly visible moment instead of spread evenly across every player. Which is precisely why casinos are happy to publicize those wins loudly. The marketing value of one visible seven-figure winner is worth far more than it costs, once the mathematics of the whole system are accounted for. Here's what happens when the statistical edge is real. The customers show up and the business fails anyway. In 2012, a new casino called Revel opened on the Atlantic City boardwalk, built at a cost of $2.4 billion, one of the single most expensive casino projects in American history at the time. It was designed as a luxury, non-smoking property meant to attract a younger, wealthier crowd than the rest of Atlantic City's aging casino strip. Morgan Stanley, one of the project's original financial backers, walked away from it in 2010 before it even opened, taking a write-down of roughly $1.2 billion rather than continue funding construction. Revel opened anyway, finished with other financing, and closed just over 2 years later, in September 2014, having never once turned a profit in its entire operating history. It was sold at bankruptcy auction to Brookfield Asset Management for $110 million, about 4.5% of what it cost to build. Industry analysts pointed to a specific strategic miscalculation. Revel leaned heavily into luxury amenities and design over the gaming floor itself, in a market where gaming revenue, not room service, was still what actually paid the bills. Revel wasn't alone that year. By September 2014, Atlantic City had lost 4 of its 12 casinos within months of each other: Showboat, Trump Plaza, the Atlantic Club, and Revel. A fifth, the Trump Taj Mahal, a nearly billion-dollar resort when it opened in 1990, styled after an actual palace, teetered on the edge of the same fate, saved only at the last moment by a labor deal and emergency financing from an outside investor, before finally closing for good 2 years later anyway. The pattern across nearly every one of these closures was the same. Genuinely enormous upfront construction spending, financed heavily with debt, in a regional market that had grown more crowded with competition, both from newly legalized casinos in neighboring states, and from a market that simply couldn't support that many billion-dollar properties competing for the same customers at once. Now look at what happened to a property built in the same city during many of those same difficult years. The Borgata, which opened in 2003 and remained one of Atlantic City's most consistently strong performers throughout the wave of closures happening just blocks away, survived the exact same competitive pressure, the exact same neighboring state legalization, and the exact same aging local market. The difference wasn't the house edge. Every casino on that boardwalk was running the same mathematically guaranteed games. The difference was how much debt got stacked on top of the construction cost, how realistic the initial demand projections were, and whether the property was built to survive a genuinely bad stretch of years rather than assuming the good years would simply continue indefinitely. None of these failures happened because gamblers stopped gambling. Atlantic City's total gaming revenue didn't collapse to zero during this period. It simply couldn't support as many billion-dollar casino floors as had been built during the boom years leading up to it. And when the market corrected, the properties carrying the most leverage against the thinnest demand were the ones that went first, regardless of how favorable the math on any individual slot machine happened to be. The human cost of that correction is worth naming directly, because it's easy to talk about balance sheets and forget what a casino closure actually means on the ground. Revel's closure alone put more than 3,000 people out of work in a single city, on top of the thousands more laid off across the other 4 properties that shut down the same year. A casino isn't just a financial instrument that can be written down to zero on a spreadsheet. It's one of the largest single employers in whatever town it sits in, and when the leverage behind it collapses, that collapse arrives as thousands of individual job losses on a single afternoon, not as an abstract line item in a bankruptcy filing. Put a full year on a mid-sized commercial casino, the kind most realistic new operators would actually be licensing rather than a billion-dollar resort tower, starting with the version where things go according to plan. In the optimistic scenario, the property secured its license in a state with a reasonable tax structure, built with a conservative amount of debt relative to realistic demand projections, and opened into a market that wasn't already oversaturated with competing floors. The slot floor performs close to the regional average, table games fill a healthy but not overbuilt share of the floor, and the loyalty program successfully identifies and retains its highest value repeat customers without overspending on comps for players who were never going to be profitable anyway. Revenue comes in predictable and strong, the state's tax bite is absorbed comfortably within the margin, and the property generates a genuinely healthy return on the capital it took to build, year after year, precisely because the house edge is doing exactly what it's mathematically supposed to do across a large enough sample of players. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 ordinary things go wrong at once. Nothing scandalous, just the normal friction of a genuinely capital-intensive business. A neighboring state legalizes casino gaming for the first time, pulling a meaningful share of border customers away to a closer, newer option. Construction and renovation costs, always a moving target in a capital-heavy business, come in higher than budgeted on a required amenity upgrade. And the debt taken on to finance the original build, serviced comfortably in the good years, becomes a meaningfully heavier burden the moment revenue softens even slightly, since the loan payment doesn't care whether this particular quarter was a strong one. None of these pressures individually would sink a well-capitalized property. Stacked together in a market that's grown more competitive since the original license was secured, they can turn a comfortably profitable operation into one that's barely covering debt service on the exact same house edge, the exact same games, and the exact same statistically guaranteed math that worked perfectly in the optimistic case. That's the gap this business runs on, somewhere between a genuinely reliable cash machine and a property one bad refinancing away from following Revel's exact path. And the deciding factor was almost never the math on the gaming floor. The math is essentially fixed, tested, and regulated into near total predictability. What isn't fixed is how much debt got stacked on top of that predictable math, and whether the original demand projections were realistic or simply optimistic enough to get the project financed in the first place. Run the same divide across an entire regional market instead of a single property, because that's really what happened in Atlantic City. A market can support a certain number of casino floors at a certain average size given the population and income within a reasonable driving radius. Add capacity faster than that underlying demand grows, whether through new licenses, neighboring state legalizations, legalization or simple overbuilding during a boom, and the math doesn't get worse for any individual machine or table. It gets worse for the property carrying the highest fixed costs relative to the smaller slice of the market it now has to compete for, which is exactly why the newest, most expensive, most heavily leveraged properties were disproportionately the ones that went first when Atlantic City's market corrected. So this was never really a story about whether the games are fair or whether the house edge is real. It is real, and it works exactly as advertised. Spin after spin, hand after hand, for as long as the doors stay open. This was a story about what happens when a genuinely reliable mathematical edge gets attached to a genuinely unreliable amount of debt, built on demand projections that assumed the good years would never end. None of the formats in this video are doomed, and none of them are guaranteed. A conservatively financed property in a reasonable tax jurisdiction with realistic demand projections can generate decades of the kind of predictable cash flow that first drew investors to this industry in the first place. A property that borrows aggressively against an optimistic forecast, in a market about to get more crowded, can lose 95% of its construction cost in under 3 years, no matter how many customers walk through the front doors every single night. What separates the two was never the house edge sitting on the felt. It's the leverage sitting on the balance sheet and whether anyone stress tested that leverage against a genuinely bad year before the concrete got poured. The operators who make this work across decades tend to describe the business the same way. The games are the easiest part to get right because the math has already been solved for you by regulators and mathematicians long before you ever apply for a license. The hard part was never running an honest game. It's underwriting the building around that honest game as conservatively as the math inside it, instead of betting the entire property on a forecast that assumed the crowd would only ever get bigger. If you had $1 billion to put into this industry, would you rather build one spectacular new resort or buy a controlling stake in 3 or 4 smaller, already profitable properties instead? Tell me in the comments. If this laid out numbers you'd never actually seen broken down before, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you want the same breakdown for another business people think they understand, subscribe. Every week, one more business that looks simpler from the outside than it actually is.